pumpkins, and last video for World Book Day today. I have found something I thought that I had lost, which is a typed up copy of the first part of a story that I started years ago and never finished. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the start of this story. And what I want to see in the comments is if you think it's worth me continuing and writing the rest of the story after all these years. Obviously, it would probably go in a completely different direction now than it would have done when I first started writing. But let's just see. It's a story, and I'm reading this for the first time in a long while, so please bear with me. Reading it directly from the original printout. It's not on any computer anywhere. And it's a story called A Pizza Dude at Dusk. And it begins with the quote, "Take something for granted and it will be taken from you." The tomatoes slid across the breadboard of a pizza base. The glare of the window's light bulbs formed a shooting star upon his glasses as he looked intently at the task in hand. The third week in a row, Laura had been on her way back from work, the very first time she'd been puzzled by this particularly intriguing sight, which to every other passer-by had gone unnoticed. When she came to think of it, it was a pretty monotonous action to be enthralled by, and rather bizarre to be thrilled by the prospect of such a usual and day-to-day sight. But she liked it and couldn't figure out why. The redness spread evenly, perfectly covering its target as Laura continued to view from outside. Straining her eyeballs as she passed the window, making sure she only ever looked out of the corner of her eye to remain anonymous and raise no suspicion or amusement. A puzzled sigh escaped her lips as she looked to the ground and turned into her road. The night was closing in. Autumn hung in the air, breathing its stale, damp breath to fill the evening lamplight with gloom. Why? She mused to herself. Why do I always look? Okay, so he's not there every day. But when he is there at his place in the window, why do I begin to wonder? She continued to think herself about in circles, and eventually thought her way past her front door and a little down the street. As she stopped, turned, and walked back in embarrassment at having been so deep in thought that she missed her own front door, she looked up at the sky. It was a cloudy night, but at the precise moment she looked up, a cloud drifted a little to reveal a star, burning bright like a distant candle in a darkened graveyard. Lighter and a pack of blue papers, please," drawled a rather smelly, absent-faced youth who looked like he used his brains about as much as he took a shower. Laura beeped them through the till robotically, finishing the transaction in a mood that befitted that of the tiny, sweltering, dark shop to which she found herself chained, and picked up the rather ridiculous feather duster from under the counter. Every bloody morning, why do I bother? Should just let the cobwebs grow over the door, save me a job and keep the customers out. She unenthusiastically batted away cobwebs from the top of the shelves, round the edges of the front window, which puzzled her, as there seemed to be a new crop every day, but she had thankfully never once caught sight of a spider. The day passed as uneventfully as usual, and as the sun went home, the moon took over charge of the night shift. Laura went home, as the stuck-up bitch she had called a boss put in an appearance, and took a charge of an altogether less interesting light-strewn darkness. The pizza dude. Was he to take his turn upon the stage tonight? Would he dance for her, or was he in the audience? The tomatoes certainly did come out for an encore, and as her straining eye glanced from a further distance than usual, sliding their way from paste to knife to hand, she climbed up the slender yet modestly muscular forearm her eyes climbing so softly as to not disturb the delicate yet masculine scattering of hair. She made it past the shoulder to what was resting on it. That face. The remarkably ordinary face that she had seen so many times before, yet she could gladly see 1,000 times more and still be fascinated. It must be cleared up straight away that though this was no mere fancy or expression of lust, in fact that element had not even crossed through Laura's mind. This was something far beyond that, a sense of familiarity, which brought feelings of stability and confusion simultaneously. He looked up. She looked down. She went home as usual, another usual ending to another usual day. Another usual beginning to another usual morning awoke James with a screech that boomed as loud as a foghorn. He clambered out of bed, tripped over the cat, and groped about for the light switch before being able to silence his bedside alarm clock, which ironically sat on his desk and not on his bedside table. He crunched his cereal and slurped at his tea and dumped the bowl and mug into the sink with yesterday's breakfast remnants. His crusty-eyed morning vision unblurred a little as he parked his rectangular dark-rimmed spectacles on his well-balanced nose and set out. The morning frost on deceased leaves crunched like the Tesco value frosted flakes he'd had for breakfast. Pieces of lettuce and empty kebab containers lay lifeless and redundant upon public benches, waiting for the man in the luminous yellow jacket to take them to their final resting place. Yet this was a particularly usual morning on a predictably facile planet, and, as the slogan on James's t-shirt proclaimed, same shit, different day. Oh, how true that seemed, as he pondered his narrowly missed, stepping in a streak of vomit lurking outside the rougher of the village's many pubs. As the breeze climbed into his jacket to try and warm itself up, he wondered what had possessed him to want to stay on this planet in the first place. Admittedly, he had not come down to Earth by choice and had woken up on this very first morning on a new planet with a terrible hangover, loss of memory, and absolutely no idea how far away from home he was. But what had made him want to stay? 1 minute it was all quadruple front nars, imported Qualarian cigars, and trousers at half-mast. Next he found himself dealing with double glazing salesmen, reality TV, and scrambled eggs, with very little memory of the night before and no way of contacting his folks back on his home planet, a planet rather curiously named Monty. He made the best of a bad and somewhat unbelievable situation by... I've lost my place. by passing himself off as James the Human and acquiring employment at a pizza shop. He now lived in a small rented flat on the south coast, had a pet cat called William, and a worryingly large collection of spectacles, which were all exactly the same. Still, no harm in over-preparing. A feather dangled in the recesses of his mind, making his brain sneeze. He caught hold of it and followed its length along to find the source of the distraction. "She's there again," he whispered, jetting the words out in a cloud of frosted breath. "Same time every morning, with the bunch of feathers in her window. Why? Why do I always wonder who she is? I know I've seen her somewhere before, but that's impossible." James passed by the shop window on the other side of the road, eyes straining to see as much as he could, before he realised that he had walked straight past the newsagents that he was aiming for. Too embarrassed to turn and walk the few steps back, he carried on round the corner to the slightly less polite paper shop, which smelled of cigarette smoke and stale cream crackers. Somewhere, above an uninhabited stretch of desert land on the other side of the globe. It was night. In the darkness hovered an even darker expanse than the starless night sky itself could possibly contend with, but which it had to hold as the laws of gravity dictated. An object so black that sound as well as light were gobbled up hungrily by its force. Nobody noticed. The invisible force prowled above the land, and with a gust of sour air it thrust a being from its belly. Nobody noticed. Like an actor leaving the stage after his final performance, the shadows bowed and curtsied to the night sand and vanished, leaving the newborn agent growing, forming its new body where it lay in the cool sand. Nobody noticed. Nobody was there to notice. The search was now afoot. Mundane day-to-day life would not know what had hit it for one very special being that the newborn agent was sent to seek out. Bright sparks of sun glinted on the brand spanking new roundabout in the recently refurbished park. A squirrel rummaged in a bin and, after finding nothing much of interest to him, had emerged with a sweet packet firmly attached to his head like some sort of chocolatey wizard's hat. Pigeons chased a small kid with a rather large roll, most of which ended up on the floor and consequently in the pigeons' beaks. The autumnal chill pinched cheeks and froze noses enough to remind the park's occupants of the current season, as the sun shone rebelliously down on the complaining frost. A strange-looking, rather square man in a maroon suit ambled through the park, cocking his head firstly at a small mop-like dog owned by a rather small mop-like woman, and then at the squirrel. From a distance, Laura observed that the man appeared to be talking to the dog, much to the confusion of the mop-haired lady. She saw the man run his fingers through the few remaining leaves on the trees, and then, stopping to briefly touch a partially frozen puddle at his feet. "Oh dear," muttered Laura under her frosted breath. "Oh, I'd better take a detour. Oh, I always seem to get the nutter. If I got any closer, I'd end up getting trapped in a conversation about plug sockets and tuna fish before I realised what was going on." As Laura turned and wandered out by the gate to her right, the bemused and unnamed maroon-suited fellow sensed something. He did not know why or how his instincts had kicked in that specific moment, when he had been staring in wonder and slight confusion at the cracked and slightly shiny version of his own face staring back up at him. But he had sensed a sniff of his target. "Monty," he said in a rather computerized tone of voice. The mop-headed lady looked up at him and replied, "Good morning to you, Monty. My name's Beryl. Are you on holiday, perchance?" The agent said nothing. He turned with large but even strides and walked straight ahead, straight through a bed of pansies. Another usual beginning to another usual morning. James had just left his usual, rather polite and clean-smelling paper shop and decided that he'd make the morning trundle a little less predictable by going for a wander in the park and maybe doing the crossword, surrounded by those curious creatures that he'd discovered that make a delightful cooing noise. James walked along the pathway, admiring the brightly coloured flower beds either side of him and feeling quite cheerful as the sun shining on his cheeks took the edge off the chill in the air, until he noticed something unusual about the pansies. He also noticed that a funny little lady and her dog were standing there, looking aghast at the poor trampled darlings and trying in vain to prop them back up again. "Oh dear," sighed James. "Whatever happened there?" "Madness," she replied. "Utter madness. Young people and their drugs, I say. Drugs!" James looked down at the crushed bodies of the pansies in a startled manner. "Drugs? Do they usually make people stamp on flowers then? The lady pushed her floppy hair away from her eyes as she rose from the grass and said, well, he must have been on drugs or mad, and he kept muttering away in some language I've never heard. To the squirrels and to my very own little doggy. Kept mentioning something about Monty, whoever he is. I really don't know. She carried on like this for a few more minutes. As far as James was concerned, it could have been hours. He was in a daze. He did not like the sound of this one bit. Could you describe the man at all? James interrupted. Oh, yes, not that it would do any good, mind. He'd be well away by now. It may be important, he said. He insisted. She sighed. Well, if you really want to know, he was a funny-looking chap. Foreigner, I'd say. Silly square 1980s haircut. Sunglasses in autumn, I ask you. Oh, maroon suit and a very strange accent. James thought briefly, ruffled the dog's shaggy coat, then did the same to the woman's hair, hurriedly said thanks, turned, and ran as fast as his Montonian legs would carry him, straight through the opposite pansy bed. There we go. That is how far I got last time, all those years and years ago when I started that story. So let me know what you think. Do you think I should continue with the writing of that story, or do you think it was complete and utter twaddle? Be kind and leave me some thoughts in the comments, and I shall see whether I will continue and finish the story. Happy World Book Day to you all. I'm off now. See you all later, pumpkins. Bye-bye.